Well, my friends, it's Safe and Effective Part 2. We're going to talk about some research about adverse effects of the thingamajiggy that you know what I'm talking about. And I think it's now we're at a place in society where hopefully YouTube and some of the other platforms where this will be posted will not wipe me from the internet for at least talking about articles that are being published now in peer-reviewed academic journals. One article that we're going to talk about here was published in none other than the Trends in Molecular Medicine. The title here is Adverse Effects of COVID-19 mRNA Vaccines, the Spike Hypothesis. This is so important. And I know for some of you, this conversation is like beating a dead horse, but for a lot of you, it's not, because the holidays are coming up. You're going to be getting questions from your friends and your family members around the Thanksgiving and Christmas table about why you didn't get the new bivalent booster, little Johnny. Why didn't you vaccinate your 5-year-old? These are questions that are going to come up. And so I'm trying to arm you with information that was considered hitherto a conspiracy theory that now researchers and clinicians in the field recognize some of these adverse effects that were not fully either understood or disclosed at the time that these compounds were rolled out. Later in this session, we're also going to talk about a really compelling article from a doctor who I know. He's a cardiovascular focused physician in the UK. His name is Asim Moharta. We have actually shared the stage together at Metabolic Health Summit back right before COVID hit in January of 2020. So a great person. He actually unfortunately lost his father, who was 73 years old, who had excellent cardiometabolic health, did all of the lifestyle recommendations and modifications that Dr. Asim recommends. So soon after getting an mRNA vaccine, his father actually died from coronary artery disease, even though he was very healthy, one of the healthiest individuals of his age. And he himself was a contributor to medical journals and so forth. And autopsy results show like up to a 75% somewhat blockage in his major coronary arteries, which blew Asim away. And so what he did is he went back and really scrubbed through the literature and found that we were actually told about the relative risk in terms of the benefits linked with taking the vaccines, not the absolute risk reduction. So this is really important stuff, my friends, and we're going to get to that. But first, I do want to share this paper here. And I wish this paper was published around last Christmas, because I had unfortunately a contentious conversation at my family Christmas table about why I was not vaccinated and why I was not going to vaccinate my daughter, who was 9 at the time, with family who I deeply care about, who I want to not have friction with. But because our sources of information couldn't be more different, my family, as much as I love them and as much as support they offer to me, they consume a lot of mainstream television as their main media source, NPR, CNN, and the like. And so they were just completely bewildered by the fact that I did not want to get an mRNA-based vaccine for a virus that I've already had and have proven to have immunity against. They couldn't believe me. And one of the reasons why, the primary reason I would say, that I chose to not get either Johnson & Johnson or an mRNA vaccine is because the spike protein is not benign. This is important. And so this is what this paper talks about here. Adverse effects of COVID-19 mRNA vaccines, the spike hypothesis. So I think, we overlook this as a whole, as a collective, as society. The individuals who created the vaccine technology, which, look, this is pretty interesting technology, right? You're getting a precursor to a protein. Your own cells make the protein. But it turns out, I think they picked the wrong protein. The spike protein is how, as you know, SARS-CoV-2 enters into your cells. It's basically like the Trojan horse. Remember, viruses are intracellular obligate parasites. They get into your cells, they borrow your own machinery to their own benefit, they replicate, and they move on to other cells and infect adjacent cells. Well, part of that process is mediated by the spike protein, which is not benign. The nucleocapsid, there's other proteins within SARS-CoV-2 are actually benign. The nucleocapsid would have been a much better target for the mRNA-based vaccines. But unfortunately, that wasn't the target. It was the spike protein. Now, it turns out that the spike protein, it's cleaved. It doesn't stay locally within the deltoid like we were promised for a year. It is found in the prostate. It's been found in the bladder. It's been found in the uterus. It goes all over the body. And it turns out that the spike protein elicits the innate immune system. That translates into it causes inflammation. Okay, so you take an individual who's sedentary, who's overweight, who's already chronically inflamed, and you give them billions or millions of molecules of spike protein because their ribosomes within their cells are making this, it's getting cleaved and it's going everywhere. And in a subset of those individuals, it can create things like autoimmunity, inflammation. It can create Bell's palsy and neurodegenerative things and so forth. And we've been told, well, the virus infection itself also causes those things. And yes, that is true. But this is why we should have applied risk assessment. Low risk people that are not at high risk for developing the chronic conditions linked with COVID, we should not have forced them to get something, especially if they have already experienced the whole virus itself, okay? That's been my point all along. High risk people are a different conversation. But it turns out that the spike protein, and I'm not going to read every little sentence in this paper, but this paper goes into the pathology, specifically the immunopathology that is mediated by the spike protein. And again, I'm not being anti-vaccine here. This occurs with the virus itself too, right? You get spike protein, especially if you have a high viral load with the actual infection. But that is part of the problem. And one of the challenges with the spike protein is it has some ability to induce clotting cascades and interfere with clotting and blood coagulation, which can lead to some of the consequences when it comes to adverse effects from the immunization. So that's one point. Point number two that I think is important to recognize is the lipid nanoparticle that's used to deliver the mRNA is actually immunogenic in and of itself. So we have two potential immunogenic aspects linked with this vaccine, and that could be then linked mechanistically to the adverse effects that were under-recognized or were told are not important. And again, I think if we're injecting things into our body, whether they're dietary supplements or they're prescription drugs or they're vaccines, we should be concerned about the potential side effects acutely, chronically, and what are the benefits linked therein, which is an important time now. I think it's time that we talk about this paper from Dr. Asim Moharta, who is a physician in the UK. The title of this paper here is Curing the Pandemic of Misinformation on COVID-19 mRNA Vaccines Through Real-World Evidence-Based Medicine, Part 1. So he goes on to talk about the history of vaccines, how he's very pro-vaccine in general, how vaccines have helped enhance life expectancy and reduce the burden of acute infectious diseases and virulence. You know, we think of polio and smallpox and all of these different pathogens that we're all exposed to. However, he goes on to talk about his father and the loss of his father. So that is a very personal, anecdotal experience, obviously, because it directly impacted him. You only have one father in this world, and if your father dies and has a good medical history shortly after receiving one of these compounds, obviously you want to do some digging. And he went on to do some digging, and this is where I'm just going to read to you verbatim. I might cut and chop and things like that, but I think it's important that we understand this, and this paper is really well done. And again, this is a paper that I would love to share with my immediate family and extended family, because I know how exuberant they are when it comes to getting the latest and greatest technology that's being promoted by public health officials and the media. But we should understand the potential risks that technology might garner. So here we go. He goes on to say, a doctor's experience. Volunteering in a vaccine center, I was one of the first to receive 2 doses of Pfizer's messenger RNA vaccine at the end of January 2021. Although I knew my individual risk was small for COVID-19, at age 43 with optimal metabolic health, the main reason I took the jab was to prevent transmission of the virus to my vulnerable patients. That seems very altruistic. That's why a lot of people are getting these immunizations and so forth. He says, during early 2021, I was both surprised and concerned by a number of my vaccine hesitant patients and people in my social network who were asking me to comment on what I regarded at the time as merely anti-vax propaganda. So he goes on to talk about how he took the vaccine and all these sort of things, but then he talks about his father. On July 26, 2021, my father, Dr. Kailash Chanad, OBE, a former deputy chair of the British Medical Association, BMA, and its honorary vice president, who has also taken both doses of Pfizer mRNA vaccine 6 months earlier, suffered cardiac arrest at home after experiencing chest pain. A subsequent inquiry revealed that a significant ambulance delay likely contributed to his death. But his postmortem findings are what I find particularly shocking, inexplicable. 2 of his 3 major arteries had severe blockages, 90% blockages in his left anterior descending artery and a 75% blockage in his right coronary. Given that he was extremely fit and active, a 73-year-old man, having walked an average of 10 to 15,000 steps a day during COVID, this was a shock to everyone who knew him, but most of all to me. I knew his medical history and lifestyle habits in great detail. My father, who had been a keen sportsman all his life, was fitter than the overwhelming majority of men his age. Since the previous heart scans a few years earlier had revealed no significant problems with perfect blood flow throughout his arteries and only mild furring, he had quit sugar, lost belly fat, reduced the dose of his blood pressure pills, started regular meditation, reversed his prediabetes, and even massively dropped his blood triglycerides, a significant improving in his cholesterol profile. I couldn't explain his postmortem findings, especially as there was no evidence of an actual heart attack, but with severe blockages. And so he goes on to talk about how he starts to review the data. And he talks about something here. The title of this section is Questioning the Data. I recall the cardiologist colleague of mine informing me, to my astonishment at the time, that he had made a decision not to take the vaccine for a number of reasons, including his personal low-grade background COVID-19 risk. That seems very reasonable. But again, at the time, you were considered an anti-vaxxer if you held that position, which is complete, I think, propaganda. And so he talks about relative versus absolute risk. And again, hopefully YouTube doesn't get mad at me for sharing this because this is actually, published in the data. Okay. So he talks about how Rochelle Walensky was very surprised when even she heard, now she's a director of the CDC, but when she was working for, I think, Mass General at the time, when she heard on CNN that the efficacy of the vaccines were 95% effective, meaning that out of 100 people that got them, 95% would not transmit or contract the virus. And we know that not to be true. Now, this might be the important qualification here is differentiating absolute versus relative risk reduction. So it turns out that the trial results suggested that the vaccine was only preventing a person from having a symptomatic positive test. And the absolute risk reduction for this was 0.84%, meaning less than 1%. That's 0.8%. Okay. In other words, if 10,000 people were to have been vaccinated and 10,000 people had not, for every 10,000 people who had been vaccinated in trial 4 would have tested positive with symptoms compared to 88 who were unvaccinated. Okay. Even in the unvaccinated group, 9,912 of the 10,000 would have not tested positive during the trial. So this is important. Okay. We were told, the world at large was told not about absolute risk reduction, but relative risk reduction within the trial. And he goes on to talk about how the absolute risk reduction figure, 0.84%, is extremely important for doctors and patients to know. But how many of them were told about this at the time? No one. Everyone said 95%, 95%. We were not told about the differences here between absolute and relative risk. And this is very important because we see this all the time. And this is not new. This trend, if you've been following drugs over the course of the years, from Vioxx to statins to all sorts of medications, okay, we are not always told about absolute risk. We are told about relative risk. And there's a major difference here, my friends. And so he goes on and talks about all sorts of different factors. I'm not going to read all this to you, but I implore you to download this paper, to read this paper, and then share this with friends and family. Not to spread vaccine hesitancy, not to dissuade people from making decisions, but to help people understand the risk-benefit analysis and the differences between relative risk and absolute risk. So I think that is the important point. Many of the people that have been censored or throttled back on social media, we're not spreading misinformation. We've already had the virus, many of us, and so we did not feel the need to go and increase our protection when there are unknown risks, okay? And so I think that is the trend throughout our videos that we've talked about. I implore you to make your own health decisions. I implore you, first of all, the more healthy you are, the better you will withstand any infection, especially SARS-CoV-2, and also, if you choose to get a vaccine, the more healthy you are, the better your immunologic response will be, and it will reduce the likelihood of serious adverse effects from this. And so that's what I want to share with you, my friends. And, I think we're at a place in society now where it's not so controversial. Thankfully, we have people that are digging deeper into the statistics, and we have scientists that are looking at potential immunopathology linked with the spike protein and all of this. And all we're asking for is transparency in the literature and honest conversations with regards to absolute risk and relative risk, and considering natural immunity, prior infection, and one's own risk of having severe outcomes. That's what we've been trying to talk about, at least on this platform specifically. Not spreading fear-based messaging. You know, I've tried to educate you guys and gals from day one, January 2020, when I saw face masks were sold out, but yet McDonald's was the busiest I've ever seen it. I knew, and I'm not trying to get credit for this, but I knew society was going to botch their response to this emerging pathogen, and surely we did. We see people now have gained more and more weight. People are more and more unhealthy. Children now are scared to take off their face masks because they hide behind them. These are like the new sunglasses in grocery stores. People wear sunglasses and a face mask because they don't even want to interact with other people. Social connection, really, seeing faces. This is part of the human experience, my friends. So it's time that we now start to really have these honest conversations. So thanks as always for tuning in. If you want a shirt like this, the germ is nothing, the terrain is everything. It's linked over on our website at myoscience.com. Use the code podcast to save. We have a lot of great shirts to help inspire meaningful conversations. I will tell you, when I go to the gym, when I go to the grocery store, when I'm out in public, I always wear these shirts, and I meet a friend every time. And I'm not just saying that to sell t-shirts, right? These are low margin things. I'm trying to help you have these same sort of interactions, because people are like, yeah, make natural immunity count again. Like, I wear that on airplanes all the time, and I get so many high fives. So many people say, where can I get that shirt? And I give them my cell phone. I'm like, hey, text me. Here's a link. Here's this code. So I want you to have those same interactions. So links will be below to these t-shirts and the articles that we talked about today. As always, friends, thanks for sharing this video. Thanks for hitting the like button. We'll catch you later. Bye now.